welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, where I discuss and review all manner of interesting music and film. Today we're going to be taking another peek at some of the black metal I have kicking about. Yeah, if you've seen the first black metal roundup video, then you know what to expect. Assorted grimness from all over the globe, from classic old school stuff to altogether more modern releases. So if that sounds your thing, please stick around. Okay, so we kick off with Sodom's In the Sign of Evil and Obsessed by Cruelty. Now, could this classic compilation of their debut EP and LP perhaps be considered the Trout Mask replica of first wave black metal? Well, what I mean by that is, to the untrained ear, as with that notorious Captain Beefheart effort, this'll probably sound like unbridled chaos for a good few listens. Yeah, as if someone took disembodied elements from multiple Motorhead, Venom and Slayer songs and pushed them down a particularly bumpy flight of stairs to see which could reach the bottom fastest. Give it time though, and like with the Magic Band, you'll perhaps find that Sodom had their own bizarre internal dynamic going on, wherein no matter how crazily off the rails the songs appear to be going, somehow the unhinged drum fills always land in the right place, the riffs chop and change on a knife edge, and Tom Angel Ripper's savage vocals weave their own strange path through the overgrown sonic forest of speed-thrashing, black-and-roll insanity. Again, drawing a parallel with Trout Mask, clocking in at an exhausting 57 minutes with little in the way of variation. Playing it again recently, I was reminded that this Sodom twofer is perhaps best consumed in small servings to avoid ear fatigue. Yeah, since owning it, I've pretty much always just let it play through, and as a result, false weakling that I am, have invariably ended up flagging by the second half, with my attention wandering off. So yeah, unfortunately I'm way less familiar with Obsessed than I ought to be, so I'll be heeding my own advice on the next playthrough to make up for lost time. As for the EP tracks though, what more needs to be said? Yeah, each and every one is a stone-cold classic of primitive 80s underground evil. So yeah, if you're new to black metal and want to discover where its roots lie, then this is one of many touchstones to check out on your journey. Oh, and just to be the umpteenth person to point it out, but if you're a purist about this sort of stuff, be warned that whilst the booklet and CD track list correspond with the German version of Obsessed by Cruelty, as released on LP by the Steamhammer label, what's actually included on the disc is an earlier recording of the album which Steamhammer initially rejected. Despite this, rather bizarrely, no one has ever bothered to correct the screw-up, meaning the re-recording of the album, replete with one extra track, remains a vinyl-only affair to this day. So yeah, confusing stuff all round, just to add to the dizzying madness of the music. We move on to F.O.A.D, a split by the Portuguese project Corpus Christii and the Canadian outfit Thesyre, as released by the now defunct Dutch label Sadolust back in 2004. Now, according to the little message on the back of the booklet, opinions count for nothing when it comes to this CD, which is just as well really, as I don't have too much to say about it. The Corpus Christii half, consisting of old, previously unreleased material apparently, is just your common or garden, drum machine propelled BM, with the fast, violent, chromatic power chord heavy opening assault, eventually giving way to a satisfying, classic period Darkthrone homage in the form of Nightclub, which is probably my favourite thing on offer here. Speaking of homages, in addition to Corpus Christii and Thesyre swapping a song apiece of their own to reinterpret, We also get a couple of stabs at the oft-covered early Mayhem standard Death Crush. Yeah, I lose track of how many different cover versions of this song I've heard, with the Thesyre's more straight-ahead version coming just 2 tracks after Corpus Christie's, which is a bit weird. That said, both versions are listenable enough, but as far as covers go, for me, they pale in comparison to Acid Enema's utterly insane Gabba techno mangling, which you can find on the split they did with Zaster. But going back to the Thesyre, the rest of their half is also pretty no frills, with yet more chromatic power chord guitar action and meaty root note bass lines doing the musical heavy lifting underneath leader Eric Sire's dry, distorted croak. The band mix up a certain amount of thrash and punk into their BM, with mostly very short songs played with razor-sharp, almost clinical precision. And yeah, speaking of punk-infused blackness, the penultimate track here is yet another cover, this time of fellow Canadian Zakitsa's anthem, Sang Nordique. Though I have to say I much prefer the original's filthy fuzziness over this rather sterile sounding take. Closer, independent, is the longest thing here at 8.5 minutes. It's cocksure, pacey grind, eventually breaking down into wah-wah feedback chaos over slow, doomy trudging. So another fair to middling black metal split in a veritable sea of the bloody things. Yeah, splits are obviously a big part of the BM tradition, and whilst F.O.A.D sports a handful of keepers, it's far from being a classic. It's actually ended up a bit of a distro bargain bin staple down the years, so it's maybe worth adding to an order if you spot it for cheap. Otherwise, your already groaning shelves can probably survive without it. Strangely enough, in addition to the split, I own approx 1 full-length CD by each of these bands, namely Corpus Christie's similarly homage-heavy In League with Black Metal, and Thesyre's self-titled debut, and again, they're both just alright. I've always considered at least exploring Corpus Christi stuff a bit deeper, as I absolutely love Nocturnus Horrendus's other main band, Morte Incandescente, but so far it hasn't happened. Next up we have Malcuidant, and their debut full-length, L'Hymne de la Ghilde. On this 2005 effort, the long-running but still relatively obscure French combo blurt out a curiously chaotic mixture of dramatic and melancholic guitar riffing, blown-out bass frequencies, and wild, turbulent drumming, with tortured, Varg-styled howls fighting to be heard above the din. Overall, this is one of those that you'll know if it's for you within about the first 10 seconds of hitting play. And yeah, it pretty much stays the same the whole way through, with nary a whiff of a synth or acoustic guitar interlude to break the intensity. Whilst the album is pretty short at just over half an hour, it's another that has the potential to become a monotonous background blur when played straight through due to its sonic sameness. So yeah, I found it's really worth sitting down and concentrating on each song individually to get the most out of the band's tumultuous compositional style, as they really do conjure up some wonderful riffing here, nailing the tragic, decadent quality that's so unique to French BM bands, whilst marrying it to restlessly snaking song arrangements, which jolt wildly from pride-filled galloping sections to all-out hellish war hammering and rage-fueled blasting at the drop of a hat. In terms of the true highlight here, though, for me, nothing surpasses the glorious opener, Tristessa. Back when I bought this, Malcuidant didn't have any other albums out, though I see they've picked up the pace since then, cranking out several more since 2011. So yeah, looks like I've got some work to do to familiarise myself with all that. Next up, here's dodenvaart, the one and only full length to date by the Dutch band Hekel, released in 2006. Now, I first became aware of this a while back via a write-up on the website for Aquarius Records. Yeah, some of you out there will no doubt remember Aquarius, a US brick and mortar shop and mail order service which sadly went out of business in 2016, but back in the day was the go-to place to learn about offbeat and obscure music, especially when it came to underground metal. Admittedly, Andy Connors, the guy who did the majority of the write-ups for the metal stuff, was prone to hyperbole, meaning he'd occasionally try to describe even the most straight-ahead BM as the weirdest thing this side of benighted Leames or whoever. And yeah, from what I can recall, this Hekel CD was no exception. In truth, though, whilst it has its eccentricities for sure, it's not going to be topping any strangest albums of all time lists anytime soon. Yeah, after the intimidating folk horror ritual intro piece, we're plunged into half an hour's worth of enjoyable but hardly life-altering second wave worship. Yeah, it's pretty much redundant to say at this point, but the spectres of classic Darkthrone and Bertzum loom large over Hekel's sound world, especially the latter. Indeed, after the speedy blowed ear, the pacing slows to a sluggish crawl for a while, and we really start to hear the Varg influence, albeit filtered through the depressive lens of fellow descendants like I Shalt Become, with the all-too-familiar strains of the A minor to F chord progression grinding incessantly through track 3, the title of which roughly translates to Where the Wind Whispers in the Night, I Listen. The rest of the CD follows in a similar manner, picking up some speed with Sator's Vederkehr, and the closing The Grim Mortality on the Heath, which almost touch on the perky buzzing of early Thesyre at times. These two sandwich Dudes Coup, or Death Squad in English, its melancholic, fuzzed-out arpeggios momentarily dropping us back into the pits of depressive despair. So, musically at least, as I say, this is pretty standard fare, the riffs and rhythms never wandering too far from the blueprints laid down by the Norwegian masters a decade and a half previously. Yeah, as far as any perceived weirdness is concerned, it's mainly to be found in the anguished vocal delivery, though quite whether you find the sound of a grown man losing his mind into a microphone strange, cathartic, or just plain sad is up to you, I suppose. Anyways, never the most prolific of bands, despite existing for 30 years now, the only other items in the slim Hekel discography are a late 90s demo and a rehearsal tape recorded a year before the album came out but not released until 2010. The first of these received a limited CD reissue in 2011. I have this somewhere though, despite featuring a couple of songs that were re-recorded for the album. I recall not being particularly taken with it, so it's probably time to dig that out for a re-listen. But yeah, in the meanwhile, I won't be holding my breath for a follow-up to dodenvaart, and neither should you. We finish with something altogether more familiar. The first couple of albums by the notorious Finnish mob, Impaled Nazarene. Yeah, formed in 1990, following on from a couple of demo tape and 7-inch releases. The band broke onto the scene properly in 1993 with this, Tol Cormpt Norz, which apparently sold well enough to find its way into the Finnish album charts. That such an album achieved this feat is rather impressive. Yeah, this isn't exactly what you'd call melodic or accessible stuff by any means, with the band hammering out what basically amounts to a quick-fire collage of extremity, in a little under 30 minutes. Yeah, many of the songs pass by in a blur of blackened grindcore madness, with the primitive, knuckle-headed riffing pushed back in the mix, instead with the reverb-heavy drums and vocals dominating the foreground. Said vocals of main man Mika Luutinen range from piercing pterodactyl screeches and nasty throaty rasps to low, bowel-shaking bellows, where the singer briefly sounds like he's channeling Satan himself, albeit with a bit of help from some pitch-shifting electronic wizardry, no doubt. A few of the songs do break the 2-minute barrier and feature slightly more sophisticated arrangements, with things like Body, Mind, Soul and the closer Damnation probably coming closest to being traditional, grim black metal bangers. Plus, there are several snatches of synth music on offer to give you a quick breather from the war metal barrage. Otherwise, yeah, far from being something catchy to hum along to or whatever, for me anyways, Tall Cormpt is one to stick on when I'm craving a burst of evil energy for that moment, rather than something that's gonna stick in the mind afterwards. Weirdly, what I've always found most memorable about the album are the thoroughly disturbing orgy interludes, where we hear humans, demons, and animals alike engaging in thoroughly immoral acts. We move on to the band's second full length, Ugra-Karma, which followed in pretty quick succession, emerging at the end of 1993. And yeah, whilst this starts off in the familiar style of the debut, with the out-of-control, atonal war blasting of Goat Seed, the slower and more atmospheric second half of the track hints at the more nuanced, crafted and ultimately user-friendly material to come later on. That's not to say that Impaled Nazarene had turned into ABBA on this album or anything. Nah, far from it. Yeah, the sections of relentlessly pummeling drums and brutally blunt riffing are still very much in evidence, with the likes of Chaos Goat Law and Caraxo whizzing by in no time at all, the latter wrapping itself up in just 19 seconds. What's apparent for the majority of the album, though, along with a much more balanced and satisfying sound mix, is a clearer and much more defined songwriting style, predominantly black metal in nature, but very much open to other influences. The best example being the wonderfully titled The Horny and the Horned. Still my favourite song of theirs, this one sports a beautifully melodic Iron Maiden style breakdown in amidst the frenzy, which is soon torn apart by one of Luutinen's screeches, but it's nice while it lasts. Towards the end of the album, Cyberchrist features another surprisingly emotive and melodic piece in its intro, whilst the savage, heads-down riffing of Hate is given effective ambient depth with the introduction of a chilly synthesizer top line. As well as a more pronounced punkiness in places, the biggest stylistic departure from the debut comes in the form of the so-called Antichrist war mix of the song Gottest Tot. Now, whilst it was a very 90s thing for metal bands to branch out into the realms of electronic remixing, with oftentimes extremely iffy results, this charming, industrial techno overhaul fits surprisingly well with the album's aesthetic, and to my ears at least, doesn't sound anywhere near as dated as you might expect over 30 years later. The medley of Sadistic 666 and Under a Golden Shower concludes Ugra-Karma on a mid-paced, triumphant note, the riffing hinting at the epic Viking stylings of Bathory, before fading out into oblivion. So, a good one to finish on. Now, back in the 90s, when I was very young, I was given a handful of back issues of the UK's Terrorizer magazine, one of which featured a full-page advert for this album, adorned with its striking cover art. As we now know, the band ran into legal issues as a result of using the painting, meaning subsequent pressings used alternative, markedly inferior art. So yeah, by the time I finally got around to checking Impaled Nazarene out in the 2000s, this first press was considerably harder to find than I anticipated. Okay, so that's just about enough blackness for one day. Rest assured, I'll be returning to this topic frequently over time, so if you don't want to miss out on any future videos, please hit subscribe to remedy this. Thanks as ever for watching, and I'll hopefully catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.